Okay, we are officially recording, folks. So thank you very much for coming. My name is Kathryn, and oh my goodness, I'm sorry. My cat stepped on my computer. My name is Kathryn. And I'm one of the Provincial Parent Liaisons, and I'm here with my colleague, Joy. We're going to be presenting on about being matched and what to do, and hopefully be able to answer some of the questions that you might have. Before we get into the presentation itself, I just want to go through some of the housekeeping stuff with Zoom technology. As you can tell, this is still sort of new for us as well. So for those of you who are just coming in, we cannot see or hear you, so don't worry if there's background noise or anything happening. What we have done is enabled our chat box as well as our question and answer box. So as we come along, or as we start the video, if you have questions, we really want this to be interactive. Feel free to say whatever, ask whatever as we go. Because we are sharing our screens with you, we sometimes aren't able to see all the chats as they pop up if we're changing slides. So if you have asked the question, excuse me, you have asked the question and we haven't answered it, or we've kind of moved on to a different subject, there is an option for you to click something called raise hand. And that's a way for us to get a ding right on our computer to say, hey, stop, something's happening. We also like to use this feature as well if there's any technical difficulties. So if our video has stopped like it has, or if you're having problems with the internet connection, please feel free to raise your hand and we'll try to address it as much as possible. As I already said as well, this is being recorded. So again, you'll only see Joy and myself in the PowerPoint. So if you do need to leave at any point, or you need to walk away from your computer, come back, absolutely fine. We'll be able to send out a copy of this for those of you who can't stay, or if you're coming in late, that's not a problem. So if everyone's good with that, I don't see any questions. Again, we really want to make this as interactive as possible, and we want this to be a webinar that is going to be useful for you. So any question you feel, there is no wrong questions, there's no silly questions. If we're finding that you might need a little bit more support, or you have a really specific or unique situation that you might need a little bit more support than just a simple question answer, please feel free to reach out to us and we'll be more than happy to support you. And on our end, if we're finding that someone might need more support, we might just say that as well. So please don't take offense. That's just us trying to make sure that everyone's getting the help that they need. That being said, that's all the housekeeping items that I have. Joy, was there anything else that you wanted to add at all, or if I missed anything?
I think you covered it.
Perfect. Yeah. Okay. Good. So we're going to get started, and yeah, hopefully you guys are going to find this useful, because we both have been where you are now. So let's get going. Okay, it's you, Joy.
Okay, sounds good. So my husband and I adopted a sibling group of 3 children through Children's Aid, and they joined our family together in 2011. So we have been parenting for 6.5 years, or just a little bit longer. That was after learning about our children by attending the Adoption Resource Exchange in Toronto in fall 2010, and we will be talking more about the ARE later in the presentation. Particularly for anyone who's not familiar with that already. We initially started our adoption journey wanting to adopt internationally. So we have some experience with that system as well, and we were at the matching stage in a couple of country programs for international adoption. So I will be speaking to that a little bit more later as well. And our children lived in a different region than we did, so we have also worked with different CASs in regions across the province around matching. So I can talk a little bit more about that experience for you tonight as well. Some of the unique considerations in matching in our situation included that that was a large sibling group of 3 children, and they were also very young. They were 1, 2, and 3 when they came home to us. They have Indigenous heritage, and so that was part of the matching process as well, in terms of a significant and important consideration. The distance between where we lived and our children was another one, and there were some factors to consider around some other siblings and openness with them and openness with foster families as well. And yeah, some other factors just around the children's social history that were unique to their situation in terms of trying to find a good fit for them.
Perfect. On to me. So uniquely, or maybe not so uniquely enough, I'm also a parent of 3. Although my journey is a little bit different than Joy's. My husband and I adopted our older 2 children when they were 3.5 and 15 months. Like Joy's story, we learned about our daughter at the ARE, or the Adoption Resource Exchange, when we saw a profile of a very complex needs little girl who stole our heart. We just knew about her at the time. And on our way to our disclosure meeting, which again, we'll talk a little bit more about what that is, I got a call from my worker saying, pull over. Her exact words is, there's a blip in Serenity, my daughter's file. Pulled over, got a call saying she has a baby brother. Would you like to hear about him in the disclosure? So that was a very interesting experience for us. We're parenting our older 2 for about 2 years when we got a call from our worker saying that there was a family who were choosing to place their child for adoption, and that they were meeting potential families. And it was through that experience that we actually put in a profile for our now youngest daughter, and met the family. Ultimately, we were chosen, and our daughter was placed in our arms at 4 hours old, which is extremely, extremely rare for public adoption. However, I am an example that unique things do happen to a lot of families. So although her adoption was through the public system, it very much mimicked a private adoption, because we did have, we met with them, they chose us. It wasn't an apprehension reason, it was a personal choice. All 3 of our children were matched through the Foster to Adopt program. We'll get into that again a little bit more, but just briefly, Foster to Adopt program means that we actually were considered the children's foster parents prior to adopting. And although we did have to still go through the disclosure meetings and have to go through the matching process, we were able to have them in our homes faster because we were okay with the risks that were associated with foster to adoption or foster to adopt. So currently, our oldest daughter is 7. She has 17 diagnoses, mainly as a result of prenatal exposure. So that was something that my husband and I had to really get our heads around and do a lot of research, because it can be scary for those of you who are currently in there. We know how scary it can be. Our son, who's 5, also is starting to get some diagnoses with ADHD and some trauma and attachment difficulties. All 3 of our children have all 3 levels of openness. We don't focus too much on openness in this webinar. However, it absolutely is a part of matching and understanding your own comfort level. So for my children, we have an openness order with our oldest, and what that means is that we actually went to court and have a legal binding document stating that we will have contact in a certain way. So in our way, it's 4 packages a year. Our son is a closed adoption, and although it's a closed adoption, there's no contact order. So just recently, we actually have been getting in contact with extended family at his wishes. Excuse me. And our youngest, who her birth family chose us, we have an openness agreement. And what that means is that we actually all sat down together and wrote up a non-legally binding written contract just to talk about what we want our relationship to look like. So with the openness agreement, we had very specific emails, letters, pictures, but what we found out is that we have a really great relationship. So we actually are in contact so much more than what's written on that paper that you can find with openness agreements. I know that's a very Coles Notes version of openness, so I think we'll touch base on it a little bit more further on. But if you do have questions about openness or just want to vet through your own feelings about openness, please feel free to reach out to us or to reach out with your liaison, because I know that this is a big topic to put in one bullet point. So are there any questions? Oh, sorry, Joy?
I just thought I'd mention too, our January webinar is all on openness. So that's the other way too, that you'll be able to get lots more information and have some more discussion too. So yeah, we can certainly address some questions tonight, but keep your eyes open for the link for the January one, because again, that will be all on openness.
Awesome. I knew there was something. Thank you. Okay, I don't see any questions at this point, so we're going to get into the meat and potatoes of everything. Again, feel free to type away as we start chatting. Okay. So obviously, we do have a question. 1 second. Your comment on prenatal exposures are resulting in diagnosis. How young was your daughter when your diagnosis came? Absolutely. So our oldest was 3.5 when she moved home. We knew that there were prenatal exposures because she was born in significant withdrawal and actually had a seizure shortly after birth because of the withdrawal. So it was known to us. She was not diagnosed with fetal alcohol syndrome or FASD at that point. However, we knew it was on the radar. She also had other like she's legally deafblind. She was non-ambulatory, and we knew there was significant brain damage. We just weren't sure how much of that was as a result of prenatal exposure or as a result of just genetics and having special needs. Our son, on the other hand, he moved home at 15 months. We were told developmentally he was typical. He was meeting all of his milestones. And it really wasn't until he was about 3 or 4 that we started to notice that there were some bigger developmental changes and that he wasn't just a rambunctious, not able to self-regulate little boy. And this is probably something a little bit more. And it was through that we were able to just really talk to the adoption community and saying, hey, I don't think this is just ADHD. There seems to be something more. So we got support from the Adopt4Life community. We were able to speak to our doctors, get the appropriate referrals of having an adoption competent doctor and therapist. And we'll talk about that because that is huge of knowing who to go to because doctors are very well-meaning. But if they don't know trauma, adoption, attachment, it can be very easy to get that diagnosis alphabet soup, where that's where you see ODD, ADHD, when really it could be something significant like prenatal exposure. So his diagnosis kind of was a curveball for us. We weren't expecting that, but for our daughter, we did. Our youngest daughter, we aren't seeing any signs at this point. So I know that it's something that a lot of people have questions about, and it is something that can be common among our community. So again, just getting the resources, talking to other families who have been through it, I think is a huge part of it. But also realize that Dr. Google can scare you pretty fast. If you Google fetal alcohol syndrome, like I did, I was convinced that my children, they would have no quality of life, and that, so just, take things that you hear as well with a grain of salt. But I hear talking to other families who've been there has been really helpful for me. And Joy, I don't know if you have anything else to add for that.
Well, yeah, no, I would agree with that, kind of getting as much real life sort of information, which can be a little hard to do. But I think that's the great thing about getting connected with an adoption community before matching and before placement, which we didn't have before. Yeah, in the case of our kids, there was also known drug and alcohol exposure. There was some testing done at birth, but no diagnoses. Both of our boys were assessed for fetal alcohol effects or syndrome at a year old, but again, they were developing really typically at that point. So when they joined our family at just about right before their 3rd and 4th birthdays, they didn't come with any diagnoses or any known developmental issues, but a similar sort of experience, just getting to know them, and after a while really feeling like, again, yeah, this seems to be above and beyond sort of busy toddler, preschooler boy activity and some of the issues, and seeing different things that didn't kind of resolve over time in a way that you might expect based on age, and some of those things. So we're actually still kind of in the process, although our son, who started, he's 9 now, he started working with a developmental pediatrician last winter, who has acknowledged, he hasn't sort of used the official diagnostic language, that's a whole other story, but she's acknowledged and put on paper sort of that he's you know, having certain difficulties with self-regulation and attention and those kind of things, and is noting the history of exposure to substances. So yeah, I think it can be a long process, especially if that diagnosis isn't made really early, or there's not developmental assessment sort of happening on a routine basis really early on. So it is one of those issues as well. In terms of alcohol exposure, we actually initially in our matching process were not considering. And then after we learned about our children and realizing there was alcohol exposure involved in that situation, we began a lot more intensive research and ultimately did have, you know, change our minds in terms of being open to that. But yeah, certainly not a decision to be undertaken lightly. And again, staying connected with an adoption community ahead of time is fantastic. It's a resource that would have been great when we were going through the process as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. You're welcome. So one tidbit that I forgot to share is that for those of you who are wanting to chat or share questions, you might not be necessarily comfortable in doing so out to everybody. There is an option just to ask a question specifically to myself or Joy. So if you go into the chat channel, you can say chat to everyone, or you can choose one of us specifically if you prefer to remain anonymous. We won't call your name out for any of the questions. But just so that you know, and again, these questions are amazing, so please feel free to keep them coming. So for the matching routes, I think most of us know the different types of adoption that can happen through the public system or through foster care. That can be done by your local children's aid getting the call. Other children's aids can potentially source you out as well. Adopt Ontario is an online adoption platform where they have children who are currently waiting that you can view. But on the other side of it, you're actually able to put your own profile on it and promote, maybe a bad word, but promote yourself in that sort of way where other children's aids can actually come and look at you. Adopt Ontario also has a system where they do matching. So they do go through very specific questions. It can be a pretty lengthy form based on your comfort level and your experience, and they can actually support in matching. So when we were going through our adoption process, we would get emails from Adopt Ontario saying, hey, there's a couple of children who fit your criteria. Give them a look. If you have any other questions, give us a call. So they're an absolute amazing resource. I called Adopt Ontario probably about once a month. They knew me pretty well. Just to make sure they knew who we were, and that the children's aids knew that our profile were up to date, because that's a huge thing about their profiles, making sure that your information is up to date. So as life changes, as anything changes in your family, make sure you keep those up to date as well. And it's a pretty user-friendly system, I find, as well as the ARE. So both Joy and I talked about the AREs. And I'm sure some of you have attended or at least heard of it. Some of you have never heard of it before. So just very briefly, the ARE is a big convention, basically, where different Ontario Children's Aids come together, and they're able to profile children who are currently waiting for adoption. So there's usually 8 or 9 different children's aids, and there can be anywhere from, I don't even want to guesstimate, a ton of different children, varying in needs and ages, sibling groups, and it's basically a time for you to go and face-to-face meet these workers, ask specific questions about children. You're able to put in something called an expression of interest, or an EOI, and that's what happened in our case. So we saw a little profile. It's usually a 1-page sheet with pictures and some more info about them. We saw this cute little girl, saw her profile. They have little videos, so we saw a video of her, and that won us over basically. And from there, we were able to put an expression of interest in, and we were able to hear back. You're curious about disclosure meetings. Yes, we will be talking about disclosure meetings. I'm sorry. And you might be hearing the term disclosure meetings. Every children's aid probably has a different word for this. That's just the terminology that my children's aid uses. Sometimes they just call them case conferences. So we'll definitely get into what a disclosure meeting is, or what those case conferences are, and what you can do to prepare and what to expect from them. Absolutely. So once you put in your EOI, or your expression of interest for a potential child or a sibling group, the wait time to hear back from your local children's aid will vary. It depends on how busy they are, how many EOIs they receive, how many children they have profiled. I mean, some children's aids have 10 or 12 children, and if 50 people apply for each child, it does take some time. So a question that we get a lot is, how long do you wait till you hear back? In our case, we were the only family to express interest because our daughter is very complex. We heard within a month that they wanted to have the next step, in our case, the disclosure meeting. There's other times where people are waiting 6, 7, 8 months to hear anything. So unfortunately, there's no real timeline. I don't know, Joy, if you have anything else to say about the ARE at all, or the process.
I think that's a good overview, although if people have more specific questions, we can definitely address those. But
perfect. Yeah, I always want to make sure that I'm giving a general, without too much information. The AREs, if you have not been before, is absolutely overwhelming. 90% of families that we host, Adopt4Life hosts the resource village. So as you go in and become completely overwhelmed and don't know where to turn to and can't process, we have a little hub that we can support families, answer questions, help you process. It's very overwhelming. Like I said, 90% of people end up saying that they can't process it or get upset because it's hard to see. It's hard to see so many children waiting. So if you are a single, if you're a single parent awaiting to adopt, we highly suggest to bring a support person, and we'll absolutely be sharing the information as the AREs come up as well. So just look at our Facebook and we'll be able to share that information. There's also, obviously, through private and international adoption, matches do happen. So we're going to be going through those as well. I'm sorry, I'm just going to take a sip of my tea. So public matching, as I had mentioned, it's done through local children's aids. In order for a child to be eligible for adoption, they have to be made a Crown Ward. And so what that means is that the children's aid legally becomes the parent's guardian. There's a 30-day appeal period where birth families are able to appeal the Crown Wardship the Crown Wardship designation. And once that 30 days is over, they will be able to place the child up for adoption. The timeline of Crown Wardship varies, so I can't give you a timeline. Every children's aid has their own different process, so it's hard to say after a year every child is Crown Ward because it's so hard to find. If a child is over the age of 7, they have to be able to consent to the adoption. So if you are considering an older child adoption, that is absolutely something that you need to be aware of, that the child has the right to consent or to deny themselves. Kinship adoption, is primarily people hear of kinship adoption and they hear an aunt or grandma adopting a child. That has been broadened over the years. And so a kin or kith adoption can actually include people who are in the person's circle, the child's circle. So coaches, and we know a bus driver who ended up adopting one of her students because she had a great relationship with them. So what kin is considered nowadays is very broadened. Customary care as well is something that isn't necessarily legally binding. It could be you're caring for a child for a period of time, or you're co-parenting a child, or there's not necessarily legal documentation, but you're absolutely raising the child. As well as foster with a view or duly approved, which is what happened in my case. So I went into adoption not wanting to foster because that was a scary thought to me. I didn't think I'd be able to handle the potential of losing the children, because in children who are in foster care, the primary goal is for them to be reunified with a birth family or with a kinship family, someone in their their birth line. However, becoming duly approved is, sorry, something just popped up. Being duly approved is something that isn't that big of a process. It's literally 2 pages. You sign, you fill out the form, you become duly approved. In our case, our children were made Crown Ward, but it was still during the 30-day appeal process, and they were quite positive that the birth family would appeal, which in our case they did for our older 2. So that just made the process a little bit longer and a little bit more complicated. And another thing to know about foster with a view or foster to adopt is not all children's aids do that. So it's really important that if it's something that you may be, I see a question, just one second. If that's something that you might be considering, first, just make sure that you can even do it in your region before you try and go through the hoops of finding out if that's something you can do. When you say a child over 7 has to consent to the adoption, do you mean the consent to being adopted? Yes. Yes, very good question. So biologically, the child is 7 years or older. They themselves need to consent to the adoption. It doesn't mean they sit down and have a full disclosure about their birth history. It's just to make sure that the child understands what adoption means, that they're comfortable with the adoption. If a child is Crown Ward, the birth family does no longer has any legal binding rights towards the child. So although they might be contesting the adoption, really they don't have any say. But the child, yes, has to be developmentally. If the child is younger, they absolutely will take that into account. For instance, my child is 7. She developmentally is at about a 1.5 year range. There's no way she would be able to tell them. So they do keep that into account. But they don't, there have been instances where a child is a bit older, was placed into the home that they weren't comfortable with or they didn't feel was the right match themselves. And the biggest part of consent is permanency, and we don't want an adoption breakdown, and you don't want to find out a 1.5 years later the child didn't even want this adoption in the first place. So it's just really about opening up a conversation. There are children who do get scared, who say, I don't want to be adopted, but it's about vetting those emotions, not just saying, oh, the kid says no, we're done. It's just about having that conversation and really understanding why. Is this a fear? Is this past trauma or attachment concerns, or is there actually a legitimate reason why the child wouldn't necessarily consent? So it sounds scary that a child would have this power, but just know that it's not the child says no and everyone walks away. It's just really to keep the child's best interest at heart, really. So I hope that answered that question. So you can get a contact from your worker, and this is what we call, the call. Every time you get a block number calling you, I don't know, I remember my heart would stop every single time. And you could hear about a potential match or a potential placement. So that's another way that you can hear about the matching process starting. As well as getting information shared about the child. So a lot of times you'll get a call from your children's aid saying, hey, I think, there's a great kid I just heard about, I think he might be a good match. You're not, once you say yes, it doesn't mean you're in, that's it. It basically means that you're saying yes to the next step. So in public adoption, what that means is that you would then be able to get more information. So in our case specifically, it was medical notes, case notes that you'll see some blackening just to respect the privacy of the birth family. And once you gather that information, you sit back down with your worker. You can ask as many questions as you want. I think I had a whole notebook of questions just based on medical things, as well as just making sure that you are comfortable in proceeding to the next step. So a lot of times in the matching process, it seems it can be very overwhelming, and
I think Kathryn has frozen there. Give her a second to see if that comes back on. I'll maybe see under nope.
Pressure to hurry up and answer. Sorry, I'm just.
Whoop.
Uh-oh.
I think you got out on us there for a minute, but I see you again.
You can just see me. Okay, just one second. I'm just going down to a better connection. Sorry, everybody.
That's okay.
Okay. I can see you all. Sorry. I'm just going downstairs because I have my modem down there. You guys can hear me okay?
Yes.
We're good? Okay. Hopefully. Sometimes when we have the baby monitor on, it can interfere. So I apologize, everybody. I'm just turning it off. Okay, so yes, with the, by saying yes on the phone, have you heard of some agencies discouraging, have you heard about some agencies discouraging matching and working through Adopt Ontario and AREs? It can happen. It's hard because everyone has the children's best interest. In my personal experience, is all I can really talk about is my agency was open through matches through any means. So have some agency discourage matching and working just with Adopt Ontario. I'm sure it happens just because it's a bigger venue to get a lot of prospective families. As opposed to the one-on-one matches. So I can't really talk about what other agencies do, but I mean, I'm certain that it happens.
I think there can be a few different reasons for that. I haven't had really direct experience, but I know that sometimes there are different opinions about the use of public websites for having child profiles and those kinds of things. And I think that, sometimes agencies may have their own position on supporting that kind of a process, but every agency certainly is different, and ours was certainly very supportive of our adoption through the ARE, but I know that each agency can be quite different in how they approach those things.
Absolutely. And some, like you had mentioned, they said our agency seems to only be offering foster to adopt. Some
Yes.
agencies, you're finding that they are going in that direction where they only want to foster to adopt. There's other
Yes.
agencies who won't even consider it. So the unfortunate thing is that there is no real consistency in the programs, and that every children's aid kind of, they'll run on what they feel is the best interest. So what one person's experience is going to be absolutely different to someone depending on their children's aid. So I apologize, it seems pretty frustrating that other people seem to be able to have more choices and more opportunities, but that's what we're here to do, is hopefully help support you. There was another comment as well about trying to get more information about your children. That's something that we are going to help discuss, is about advocating to make sure that you're making the best choices. So that we will be discussing that as well. So just to make sure we're back on track, because I don't want to take up too much time on this. Once you get that information, this is where the disclosure or the case conference meeting happens. You get to talk to your, I apologize, my dog's going to be barking for a while. You get to meet with the children's aides, the foster families, and be able to ask a lot more questions and request a lot more information. So there was a question about what you can do to get more information. During these case conferences or disclosure meetings, you'll be able to request more as well. But we're more than happy to also help support you in advocating for that to make sure you have more information. Okay. Adopt Ontario, we've talked about that already, so that's through the process. You can get an email saying, hey, we think we've matched. You call, and the process can happen that way. And the ARE, which I think I spent a lot of time on as well. You'll be shortlisted for potential families. They'll request your full home studies. You can do an in-person or a phone meeting. Again, going back to that disclosure meetings, as well as additional meetings. So once you have that main meeting, it doesn't mean you've made the decision and that's done. That really is just kind of the main meeting to get the ball rolling. We had, I can't even count how many meetings we had before we finally confirmed yes for our daughter. So please don't feel pressured to say yes and that's it. It's something that's going to be continuous as you go. Yep. Okay, so I seem to always talk ahead of my slides. Foster to adopt, we talked about as well. The benefits of foster to adopt is that you tend to have the children in your home at a younger age, and it tends to be a faster process than through straight adoption. The cons or the downsides to it is that these children are fostered, and the children's aid need to look at placing the child back with their birth family before placing them with you for adoption. So there is absolutely that risk that can happen, that you can be fostering a child for a certain amount of time and they will go back with birth family. And that is something that you need to decide, you and your partner, or getting support to make sure that that's something you're able to do. You're also considered a foster parent, and that comes with its own sort of set of rules. So if you're looking to potentially foster to adopt, if you're looking for more information or want to consider it, please feel free to reach out to us, and we can kind of help put you through the process and the pros and cons of it. I know I'm just kind of briefly going through it, but I just wanted to make sure that we touched on it and that everyone knows that we're here to help and support you. And you know, if you need to hear more stories, we can link you up with other families as well. Okay. So being matched privately can look quite a bit different. So assuming that you've already gone through the process of having a home study completed by an adoption practitioner, who would typically, I think, always be a social worker who is working as an adoption practitioner, or an agency who's licensed to do home studies and private matching, and working with an adoption lawyer. So you're kind of at the stage where you've done all of that stuff and you're at the point of being ready to be matched. So private matching, the idea of you can use a profile or a family book, certainly with CAS as well. I think that this is often a more integral component of the matching process in private adoption though as well. So that's going to be a fairly detailed profile, probably lots of photos, potentially, letters to the first parent and biological family of a potential child, sort of expressing your desire to adopt and your commitments to the children and the family, and your thoughts on openness and the kinds of lifestyle that you have. So it'd be information that really tries to paint a picture of what your daily life looks like, what your personality is, how your family is made up, what you envision in terms of wanting to provide for your child, and that sort of thing. And you would be able to get lots of guidance on that through your adoption practitioner or agency that you're working with. And again, through some kind of a adoptive parent community, there would be lots of resources available to help in creating that sort of a profile. That profile is then used when parents are
looking for a family to adopt their child, and your profile could be presented for a first family or birth family to review. And if they choose your profile or express interest in your profile, then you would be informed about that, and potentially then move into the process of either providing more information or having some sort of meeting with the child's family. And again, that process could involve multiple meetings depending on whether any or all parties feel that that's going to be necessary before a decision's made. So if the child's family decides that you are the ones to raise and parent their child, then you would be given the opportunity as well then to make a decision about moving forward in that process. And throughout the process, I think, even once you've been matched, it's still an ongoing process then of beginning to build relationships with the child's family, planning for what those relationships are going to look like. And then, once the child is born, again, there is a period of time during which the child's mother is able to consider her decision and make sure that she is comfortable proceeding with the adoption plan. And then once that time period has elapsed, then the adoption can be finalized, or the placement can proceed to adoption after that point. I don't know, Kathryn, if you have any more. I haven't gone through the private matching process, so I can certainly gather more information for folks who have additional questions about that. But Kathryn, you're welcome to chime in if you have anything.
The only thing I would just briefly talk about is that it is hard meeting the family. It is hard. Just through it. It's something that please feel free to get support around. I remember second guessing what I wore, how I answered questions, and just making sure that I had the support of my worker was huge, and as well as the adoption community, because although it sounds like a pretty seamless process, it can be very daunting, especially when you're waiting to hear if they're considering more than one family. But yeah, I think Joy, you hit it the nail on the head. It's yeah.
Okay.
Just make sure you get support is all I'm going to say.
Yeah. And internationally, that is a whole different process, a unique process with a lot of steps along the way. It can feel very daunting, and having been through that process up to the point of matching and being part of online discussion forums and other, communicating with other parents who are also adopting internationally, I think most people, it's very normal to go through periods of time where you feel overwhelmed with the requirements and the checklists and the paperwork, and again, lots of timelines that are totally outside of your control. So staying connected with supports and having some coping strategies in place to kind of manage those times where you're just waiting, which is really the hardest part of all of it. The paperwork stuff, there are ways to get support. Again, your agency should be able to support you with that, online groups and other community groups. There would be information and resources available. And the bottom line with paperwork is really just getting clear on, get the checklist, and just instead of worrying about getting all of it done all at once, you kind of just work your way through one piece of paper at a time, and then you realize, okay, that you've done it, and you've got what's called your dossier ready to submit, which includes all kinds of different information, including your medicals that have been completed, and any profiles that you're going to be sending, police clearances, financial statements, reference letters, that sort of thing. And those dossiers do need to be updated periodically, depending on how long your wait ends up being, or if there are changes in your own situation or in the country program requirements, because that is one of the things with international adoption. There can be a lot of changes, both on the Canadian side of things and on the other country side of things. When we were in the waiting and matching process, there were numerous changes that ultimately led to both of the programs we'd signed on with actually being discontinued. So, those kinds of considerations are part of that process too, and just realizing changes or delays are very normal in that process as well. Once your dossier arrives in the receiving country, on that end, they'll have their own process for how they do matching and identifying children that are available who fit with what you've been approved for in terms of, age and gender and number of children and any sort of social or medical history. Once you've been matched in the child's country on their end, that information is sent to your local adoption agency or practitioner who's licensed to work with that country. Your local person will review that information, make sure that, yeah, that's a match, and then you'll get the information and you'll make the decision about that match. It's a little different. You're not going to have as much direct access likely to the child's country or people who know the child when you're considering that match, but you can certainly take the time that you need to consult with your practitioner or adoption agency. You may find some local professionals to meet with depending on the complexity of the issues or certain questions that you have. And there would be some, medical and mental health professionals who would be used to reviewing international adoption profiles and proposals to help you try and have a better understanding of the child's situation. Once you've agreed to go ahead with the match, then your agency prepares a consent report and documents are sent to the ministry, again on the Canadian side, and the ministry does need to issue final approval before that match can be finalized as well. And more countries are asking people to travel even at that matching stage just to meet the child and confirm that, yes, we want to go ahead with this adoption. That was becoming more common a few years ago when we were in the process, and I think it's even more common now. And even if a trip isn't required right at the matching stage, many countries are also requiring 2 trips, sort of one around potentially the court date, and then you would either stay in country or return home to wait for the visa and immigration paperwork to be processed on both sides. Different countries can operate very differently. Different agencies and programs operate differently. And again, sometimes the legislation changes, sometimes the process changes on both ends in terms of the Canadian or the other country's side of things. So that's just something to keep in really close touch with your agency or practitioner about as you go through that process. And again, I think all the waiting and all the multiple steps and so much of it being out of your control can be the hardest part, I think, about the international matching process for sure. Okay, so here we are at disclosure meetings, and I have from our process, and we've been adding to it as a team as more information comes in or people put their input. So I have a huge document of like really detailed questions to ask, and I don't mind sharing that resource. So folks who are interested in that can be provided. Sort of in a nutshell, it's still a fairly long little list there, but you're wanting to really try and get a picture. There's the information, that's on paper about your child and their social history and their parents' mental health and medical and social history and the circumstances of the child becoming available for adoption, their experience in foster care so far, and all those kinds of things. And all the paper information is important, but I think there's that other piece of what does this child look like in daily life? What is it like to live with this child and parent this child? And so those questions around daily life and routines and habits, how does the child respond to transitions or changes in plans, or what do they do when they're frustrated, and how do you manage that in the home environment or the school environment or in the community? What seems to work, what doesn't seem to work? Who are the people that are important to the child, to start getting an idea of the kinds of relationships that you might be thinking about maintaining for your child after they're adopted. The disclosure meeting may not be it's not the time you need to probably worry about asking about all their favorite toys and foods and all those kinds of things. You know, those questions can come later when you're actually planning for a transition, but you're really wanting to get a good sense of the big picture and any issues that you see on paper. What does that really look like in daily life to start to envision you know, being parenting and being part of this child's life on a day-to-day basis, finding out about any assessments that have been done and the results of those, and you know, finding out whether you would have access to some of the professionals who have been working with the child, whether you're able to get firsthand information from them if you feel that's important. In one situation we considered, there were actually some issues around legal status. It was a situation where the child was actually an illegal immigrant, and it came to light quite far into the transition process that the child actually couldn't yet be adopted. I think the agency hadn't really realized it yet either, but there were issues with the child's visa that were impacting that situation. So if there's anything unique like that, making sure there's clarity up front around those kinds of things. The list of questions that I have and other questions that I've seen get into some examples of trying to assess a little bit, you know, what is the child's attachment style, and, you know, are there questions around attachment issues and needs as well, and those kinds of things. I guess academically, if it's a child who's school aged, you would be starting to maybe ask some questions about how they're managing, what kinds of supports are needed in school, you know, how involved may the parent need to be in supporting the child at school, you know, with meetings or picking them up early on days they're not able to manage, again, just to get that sense of what might daily life look like. Travel and plans, I think asking, you know, are there already plans in place for what transition might look like, or what you're hoping for, or a time frame around when that transition might happen, some practical and logistical issues, particularly if there's distance involved, around how all of that might unfold as well, in terms, and then thinking through, you know, does that fit for you and your the realities of your lifestyle as well. When do you have enough information? I'm probably not the best person to ask. I've just spent weeks researching a vehicle purchase, and then we went out and bought basically what we already had. But and the same thing, I remember when we were attending a pre-adoption group through our local children's aid, and we were in the middle of exploring a potential match at that point, and one of the social workers kind of laughed at me in a friendly way, but she kind of said, oh, she's like, I can tell you're an occupational therapist just by, she's like, you love to do your research. So I tend to be someone who probably actually maybe asks too much or digs around too much, but I think you kind of have to know who you are too, and what, you know, what you feel you need to have peace about a decision that you're making. But if you're not sure, that's again, we're consulting with other parents, or finding some support for yourself to kind of weigh, you know, what information is really essential in order to make a decision to proceed, and what are some of the details and other things that aren't deal breakers that we can kind of plan for after we make the decision about the match. Certainly it's good to do lots of research and ask good questions, and there also comes a point too when yeah, you have the information in front of you, and that decision can be very hard to make. We've had to make a hard decision after lots of research to say no to a potential match. I think one of the clues, to be honest, in that situation was that we kept feeling like we needed to get more information. And in the end, I think it was a situation where it was like we kind of knew what our gut was telling us. But there was another situation in which we were matched. This was after we were no longer pursuing international adoption and were working with the public system. And it was an out-of-area adoption. We learned about these older, actually teens, through the Adoption Resource Exchange. And that was a situation, it was our first time going through matching. I wish we had had more support and taken more time to ask more questions and get more information, because we did enter a transition process, and that was a situation which we realized in the end it wasn't going to be a good match for us or for the young man involved. So it's definitely a balance, and getting some support around that if you are left feeling uncertain is really important. Yeah, so I think in the interest of time, we'll maybe go on unless there are any new questions there. But and Kathryn, if you have anything to add there.
No, I think you said it perfectly. Sometimes you just know when you know, and if you don't, you have to balance your heart and your head, which isn't always easy to do in adoption.
No,
but that's what we're here for too, as well. We do have one question. Just one second, Joy.
Sure.
How long will the podcast be? We're up until 9:30, is what we'll be going until. Wait, let me just answer one more. You're welcome. Okay, permanency planning. So I believe that. Oh, did I skip one? No.
There's a question about subsidy as well, and whether the child needs to be 8 at the time of placement or at the time of finalization. 8
at the time of placement.
That's where I was
going. If you're going for the targeted subsidy, which I believe is what the question is about, 8 at the age of placement. And you can get the subsidy while on adoption probation. It does not have to be finalized. You are able to, as soon as you sign the adoption probation papers, you're able to apply for that subsidy. I get it for my older two, and it's helpful. So promoting permanency. So really, once you have this information that I know Joy was talking about, once you feel like you're able to make a good decision, what's very important to sit down and make sure that you and your spouse or your partner or yourself, your support network, understand is what needs to be put in place to actually achieve permanency, because that's what family is, that's what adoption means. And you want to put yourself in a position to be able to support this child for the rest of your life. So there was a question before about trying to get that information, because sometimes it is difficult, especially if there's 2 different agencies. Sometimes there could be some miscommunication, and that's where that advocacy piece comes in. It's not always easy to advocate because you're obviously balancing having a good relationship with your worker. So it's important to develop those relationships, but sometimes advocacy means is asking those hard questions and making sure that you know what your bottom lines are. So if you feel that there are pieces missing to the story, or if you feel like you need to get more information, please ask those questions. And sometimes you need to ask them more than once. And if you do feel that you need more support around that, that's where your worker can come in, and that's where we can come in as well. So if you're looking for more ways to help advocate for that, that's something that we can absolutely support you through. You want to also look at the supports that you're going to have in the long term and in the short term for your child or your children. So more formal and informal supports. So in our case, we were matched with our older two. Our son moved home 3 months before our daughter because she is very complex needs, and I was not willing to have her move home until her services were in place. They live 4 hours away in a different city, currently engaged in occupational, speech, behavioral, physio. You know, she had a great amount of service, and my big fear is that I would rush to move her home because I was so excited and we'd be put on these wait lists. So a lot of times it is about negotiating that piece and making sure that they're, to the best of your ability, that the gaps in services are limited, and making sure that you are getting support for yourself as well. So if that's an attachment therapist or getting support for yourself, make sure that that's in place, because it's very easy to focus on the needs of the children. For someone who has experienced post-adoption depression, it is a real thing. It comes on faster than you realize. And I didn't realize I had post-adoption depression until I thankfully had a fellow adoptive parent say something to me. So making sure that you have your own supports is huge, which is what we're all about with Adopt4Life. Preventative measures is what's going to be key in promoting permanency, putting things in place before things start to fall apart. What preventative supports look like, I've already talked about, is formal, informal, therapeutic supports, financial supports, funding, whether that's through your children's aid. People have a lot of different experiences with getting funding for their children's aid. A lot of people have a lot of frustrations with that. Just know part of our job, on top of helping advocate for you, is also helping finding other sources of funding. So if your child does have a special need or exceptionalities and you're not too sure what you're even eligible to apply, whether it's private or through the government, please feel free to reach out to your liaison, because we've done it for our children more likely, and we've done it for other families multiple times. So if your children's aid, if their funding is to the point where they don't provide post-adoption funding, or if it's not an option, please don't think that that's a hard no. There's other sources, and we'll be more than happy to help support you through that. We touched on this before, but having an adoption competent and trauma-informed doctors are huge. They can be hard to come by. Again, this is why our community is amazing. Adopt Ontario, they are amazing. The ACO is amazing. And, you know, it's really a group of parents who have been there, who are able to provide those services. So once you get into the matching process, once you identify that there might be some needs, or you want to get an assessment like we kind of shared with our stories, reaching out to our communities, whether it's through us or the ACO or your informal adoption networks through your children's aid, wherever it is, getting the referrals for doctors and therapists who understand what trauma can present itself, and the extra layers of what adoption is imperative. Post-placement, once the placement happens, once things are finalized, again, making sure that, you know, all families know that once your file is closed, or that a placement has been finalized, it doesn't mean that the supports go away. A lot of children's aid are now turning more into post-adoption supports. Again, it is still something new, and it varies to each children's aid, but please know that your practitioner or your local children's aid, more and more departments are forming to help support post-adoptions. Education and connections. I cannot promote Pathways to Permanency training more. Every family I talk to, I tell them about Pathways to Permanency. For those of you who have no idea what I'm talking about, Pathways is a free in-person workshop that the Adoption Council of Ontario, the ACO, hosts, and it's in very different cities, different times, and I believe it's an 8-week program. And it's free. They have childcare, which is unheard of, and you learn about trauma. And the biggest thing that I hear from families is this an 8-year-old thing, or is this a child thing, or is this an adoption thing? Is this a trauma thing, or is this just being a hyper thing? And this workshop, it really gives you the tools and helps you understand where our kids are coming from, and understand how our own reactions and our own potential trauma can affect our parenting. And we try to provide more information about that as well as they come up. So please keep your ears out for Pathways when you hear it. Mm-hmm. Obviously, other webinars and workshops. So if a diagnosis of FASD comes up, just making sure that you're attending, getting as much information as you can, because obviously the more you know, the better off you can be in trying to access those supports and services. And obviously peer support is huge. When we first adopted our older two, Adopt4Life did not exist. The difference in how I did for myself as a parent between our first two adoptions and my youngest was completely different, because I had that support, and just going on Facebook and venting and sharing and knowing someone you can call who's been there and who gets it and who can validate your feelings. It is, by far the best thing that we can have as a community, is just have someone who gets it and who can provide those supports. So the ACO is another great resource. Obviously, us at Adopt4Life, just making sure you're reaching out to your communities. You're not in this alone, and it's hard, and it can be frustrating, and it can be isolating, but we've been there. So please feel free to know that we're here. Oh, there's just one question, sorry, before you start. I would love to have a liaison. So yes, so the one thing that I did not talk about, a liaison. So I'm just going to move my slide back. Okay. Your parent liaison will be assigned to you from Adopt4Life once you have been matched with a child. So if you, I'm assuming majority of you are awaiting families. So you will get support through us through Facebook or through these webinars. And once you are transitioning or have a potential match, please reach out to either Joy or myself, or to post on Facebook. We're constantly monitoring them, and let us know that you're in that kind of matching transition. And that's when we'll be able to assign you to a liaison in your area or in your region. And Joy and I cover the province. So if you don't have a liaison in your specific region, you'll be hearing from one of us. And we complete an intake. We learn more about who you are as a person, share more about who we are as an agency, and just make sure that you're aware of what is out there for you and what supports you have available, whether it's a new match or in 40 years from now. So that's who we are. So please feel free to reach out. If you need that support, we are here. All right.
Okay, so yeah, we're down to our last 2 or 3 slides here. This is a tough one. Obviously, there are times when you will learn about a child and that child does not end up being a match for you, or you for the child. And that, again, that is probably the hardest part of the journey if you get to that point. And I have been through that experience a couple of times in a couple of different ways, and it was very difficult both times. Who can decide whether it's a match or not? Children's Aid may ultimately make that decision. You may or may not agree with that decision. Other stakeholders involved may say that as well. That can happen internationally. I saw that happen to people a few times, particularly when country programs were not likely going to be sustained, and folks already had a potential match, and ultimately the Canadian government, immigration wouldn't maybe approve it, or different issues might come up with on the end of the country, where they would end up deciding actually not to have that child proceed to adoption out of country. So that can happen. Certainly in private adoption or certain public adoption situations where the birth parent is consenting, and particularly, you know, for the example of newborn adoption during that revocation period, where the parent is able to have that time to change their mind, that can and does occur at times. For an older child, there is the possibility that a child does have the capacity to understand what adoption means, and ultimately chooses, with this, you know, lots of education and support to make sure that they're making an informed decision, ultimately may choose not to be adopted by your family, and you may decide that the child or children are not a match, or that you're not a match for them. And again, that's the experience. Certainly, we've spent time considering a match, and there are a lot of feelings that go with that. So again, I would say please reach out for support. It's very normal to have all kinds of mixed feelings, even in the one situation where we really felt that we were concerned we weren't maybe best equipped to meet this particular child's needs. It was really difficult. We felt guilty about that. We felt sad about that. We, you know, wanted to be the people to be able to parent this child. We were concerned, again, what does that mean in terms of when we might have another match to consider? What will that mean for our relationship with the agency? So many complicated feelings and decisions that go along with that. In the other situation, where we had actually had a number of transition visits with a young man, and ultimately realized again that on both sides it was probably not a match. Again, lots and lots of feelings to work through there. So I've been there. Lots of other people have been there. So if you're ever in a situation where you're either struggling to make that decision yourself or have had that decision made for you, even if that's not what you would have chosen, that's definitely a time to get some support and have someone help you walk through that process, because closure is so important in those situations where it turns out that it's not a match. There's definitely a period of grieving and a sense of loss. And, you know, I think we're adopting, we want a parent, and we also want children to have parents and families. So we're grieving, I think, for ourselves and for the child in most situations. So figuring out, you know, acknowledging how do you need to grieve? What do you need to do to move through that process? Where can you go to get some support and validation? In the one situation where we decided not to proceed, there was essentially, you know, no closure from the professionals involved, and we were left kind of feeling very alone in kind of trying to wrap up the loose ends of our feelings. And in that case, actually, the foster family ended up being really helpful, and our local adoption worker ended up being very helpful. And in the other situation, when we ultimately decided that not to proceed with the match, the adoption matching worker was very, very supportive and validating of our decision, and thanked us for making that decision and being able to communicate that, knowing how hard that is to do, and acknowledged and validated that, you know, it was much better to be able to say no than to move forward out of a sense of, you know, guilt or responsibility. So that situation was really helpful, I think, to help us put our feelings in perspective and be able to move forward. Because certainly after going through a process and realizing at the end there's not a match, it can take some time to sit back. You may need some time to sit back and reflect, and again, consult with people that you trust around how do we move forward from this, and does that change the direction that we're heading, or, you know, do we kind of just pause and take a breath and then continue going on? And there's no right answer to that. So again, I think working through some of that on your own and with people you really trust and get good support from, and people who may be knowledgeable about what your different options are, can be really helpful in having that sense of closure and feeling at peace about where you're at, even if it was a difficult process to go through.
It's definitely not easy. We've been there ourselves, and yeah, it's one of the hard parts of adoption isn't easy. All of this journey is difficult, but it definitely, it's important to grieve and to make sure that you get support for yourself is huge. So the first meeting, I'm just going to very briefly go through this. This is my slide, right, Trey? Just want to make sure I'm not. This is me. Okay, I just want to make sure I'm not over
Yep,
talking.
I've got you down.
Perfect.
It's okay.
So I'm just going to briefly go through it because at this point, after you go through it, again, the first meeting does not mean 100% you are in. It was not in our case. We were very scared to adopt a child with this many complex needs. So we had a lot of discussions, case conferences, again, that disclosure meeting, and then we went to actually meet the children for the first time. So some scenarios that can happen when you're first meeting is that you can potentially be introduced as a friend, just so you can kind of have eyes on the child. In our case, that is what solidified our decision. We had a little girl who had more diagnoses than years she was on this earth, almost doubled. And she, more than doubled actually. And it wasn't until we actually saw her and we realized that she was a child and not a significantly complex needs child that really allowed us to make our final decision. You're able to, during this first meeting, just get clarifications on the expectations of yourself, the foster families. You can start to develop that relationship, the role of what they'll play. Our foster family has been instrumental, continues to be 4.5 years in. We have a great relationship with them. As well as if the child's older, you'll be able to sort of start developing that relationship and understand what their rights are, what expectations they might have as well. Another benefit of having that first meeting is you're able to see firsthand how the child responds to unplanned events, be able to ask questions and see the behaviors. So my daughter, we had, I don't know, 170-page document about her behaviors and her medical needs. What that looked like in person was a lot less scarier than what I had put into my head based on all these medical diagnoses. So just really makes it real for you. Obviously, how you prepare for the first meeting will depend on who the child is, what the situation is, if there's more than one child, if there's a special need. I mean, there's so many different variables to this. Please know that during the first meeting and that sort of early transitional supports, we're here as well. So if you're looking for transition supports, or should you bring something, or just trying to learn what other families have done, that's again where we can come in. You are not alone in this. It is nerve-wracking, let me tell you. It is nerve-wracking. I second-guessed everything I did, my hair, and it turned out to be a beautiful time that I didn't remember because I was so anxious. So just making sure that you prepare yourself, that it is a huge shock to your system, this first meeting. Second-guessed everything I said, so those are normal emotions. And then again, getting overwhelmed and questioning if this was something we wanted, completely normal at this stage as well. 4.5 years in, we still question it some days, so please don't feel like, you're, this is it and you're done and, everything's perfect. It continues to be a learning process for a lot of us. You'll be able to have different settings. So in our case, we went to the foster family, we went to a McDonald's, we went to a park, and just really saw the child in different environments and saw how they responded to the public and, their behavior to the foster family versus workers. The benefit, basically, my long-winded spiel there, is basically the benefits of being able to put your eyes on the child makes them real. The benefits of being able to see who they are is going to far outweigh any amount of paperwork that they can give you on this child, especially if the child does have trauma, neglect, prenatal exposure. There should be, and I'll emphasize should be, a lot of documentation on that, but knowing what that actually translates to this child is going to be a big difference, and it's going to help you in your decision making. So for us, we first met our daughter. She was in her school. She was in a wheelchair. She had a helmet. She was segregated from all the other special needs children. And I saw her and I freaked out, I'll be honest, very blunt. I didn't think there was any way in the world that we could adopt a child of this needs. We took the afternoon, had lunch, and met up with them again. And we got to see her outside of school. There was no helmet. She was able to walk with help. She was loving and caring and engaging. And that's when I realized that this is a child. And that's, my heart took over my head a lot of times. And I realized that, making these decisions and seeing the children are a huge part of it. So I can go on, but I'll stop. If you need support with the first meeting, with the early transitions, if you have questions, if you're not sure, please feel free to reach out to us. That's what we're here for.
Yep. And so this isn't information we'll get into a lot of detail about tonight. So probably some more webinar topics in there, but once there is a match and everybody's agreed to it, the planning begins in terms of what transition is going to look like, what those pre-placement visits are going to involve, how you're going to kind of move from meeting with a child in the community to having them in your home on and how long that process might take. And some of those plans change as you go along based on everyone's needs as well. There may be more meetings with individuals involved with the child. And you're, of course, beginning to move into starting to think about how the home environment is going to look in preparation for having your child come home. And at the same time, again, negotiating and making sure that any supports are in place that should be there at the front end, both preventatively and therapeutically. And again, I think we've kind of mentioned throughout the presentation, we are here for you. And again, providing information, answering questions, and providing guidance throughout all of these processes. We're happy to support you. And again, we have our online communities as well with other parents who have gone through or are going through similar stages as well, who are also a fantastic resource.
So that is it. That is our formal presentation. I know that it's probably a lot of information. We try to make this as broad as possible. So if you are overwhelmed with the content, if you're feeling that we didn't spend a lot of time on an area of interest for you, this is the great thing about our jobs, is that this webinar is just the tip of the iceberg. So if you're seeing this, if you are confused, or if you felt like we should have talked more about something, please reach out to us. We are accessible on Facebook, email. We're around. You can go on adopt4life.com as well, and be able to reach out. There's a lot of resources that you can find as well. So are there any final questions before we sort of formally end this webinar? I know that it's getting a bit late, I'm sure. You guys have had a long day. I don't see any. So on behalf of Joy and myself, I just want to thank you guys so much for coming on and participating and asking questions, and just learning more about this journey. And we're here, so please feel free to reach out, whether it's now or any time in your process. So I think that's it. Joy, do you have any last words before we finish up?
I don't for tonight, but I'm happy to hear from folks if anybody has any follow-up questions.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you guys so much for spending your evening with us. We have recorded this video, so if you need to listen again, feel free to get in contact with us, and I'm more than happy to send that your way as well. So I will be stopping sharing this, and I will be signing off. All right. Thank you so much, guys. Bye.
Bye.